All right, so today we're going to talk about Kurt Vonnegut, Slaughterhouse 5, and postmodernism to get started with our next unit, which is going to be reading this book. So let's talk about Kurt Vonnegut here first. Kurt Vonnegut was born in Indianapolis, Indiana, and he was born in the late 20s. And so when he went to high school and college, he studied things like chemistry and anthropology, but was also a journalist and really into writing. And I think a lot of his studies, especially in chemistry and anthropology, have allowed him to write these kind of science fiction novels and these kind of novels that are kind of out there. And as you'll see when you're reading Slaughterhouse 5, it's probably his most famous book that he has. In the war, he actually was a soldier in World War II. He was over in Europe, and he was taken prisoner by the Nazis. And he was taken to a town in Germany called Dresden, which got bombed later on, and he survived, and the war was over, and he went home after that. So I really like to talk about this book because the bombing of Dresden is something that isn't talked about a whole lot, even though it caused more damage than what the U.S. did to Japan around the same time period. So Dresden is kind of in the middle of Germany. It's a very landlocked city, and there was not a lot of importance to the actual city itself. No one there really. There was no military stuff being built there. It was just kind of a place where people were living. And in fact, throughout Vonnegut's time as a prisoner, whenever they were told that they were going to Dresden, other people would be like, "Oh, well, that's good because they won't bomb Dresden. There's nothing of importance there. They'll bomb places closer to rivers or closer, to like the borders and stuff like that. Dresden is safe," and it wasn't. And so the number there of people who died is a little inaccurate, and I think it's just because of the time period. I have read that as low as around like 60,000 people died, and I've read as much as like 175, 200,000 people died. Vonnegut in the book says 135,000 people died, so that's the number that we're going with there. Which, if that number is accurate or even close to being accurate, that is more than the bombings in Japan, Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So I just think it's interesting that this one never gets talked about, even though it was much worse than what the United States did. I'm pretty sure Britain is the one that did this one, with a little help from the United States, but it was mostly Great Britain during this time period. So this whole time we've been talking about writing styles and writing periods in American history. We talked about Romanticism, which was before the Civil War, and we talked about Realism, which is after the Civil War. And so this one is called Postmodernism. And like I said when we were talking about Realism versus Romanticism, a lot of times the writing styles happen after wars. War is something that usually makes people think in a different way, and it causes them to have a different philosophy on life. And so, again, there's not usually one date that's like, this is the exact moment that postmodernism started. I think most people would argue that there's a couple pieces in the 1940s that would suggest that the postmodernism train is a-coming. And then it kind of picked up a little more steam in 1960, and then maybe a little bit more in 1968. And then 1989 was kind of this is for sure kind of what's going on right now. Whether or not it's still around today, that would be up for debate. I think a lot of people feel that postmodernism is now dead, and we're looking for more accuracy with our writing, more historical accuracy when we're writing stuff. And I think there's a couple of pieces out there that have been kind of more recent that could definitely lend themselves to that. And I think maybe September 11th was a turning point for new text in American literature. So, what modernism did, because this is after modernism, modernism and modernists were convinced that scientific discoveries or people with philosophy, new philosophies kind of coming out during the, before the 40s was going to make everything better. Technology and building stuff was going to make things fantastic. And the 20s through the 50s, it was a time where we were building new technologies. We were building new appliances for your house. We went from radio and we started getting into the TV and all these kind of things. And we were discovering new things. We were discovering new diseases and cures for these diseases. We were discovering new ways to be, more medically sound and all these kind of things. And modernism argued that all this technology is going to make us better. Postmodernism was like, maybe not. Maybe not so much. They started looking at it as a non-science. Basically, modernism was more of a scientific method of like looking for facts and stuff like that, where postmodernism is more like the truth is subjective. It's whatever you want it to be. Modernism it's objective. It is this one thing kind of a deal. Postmodernism is definitely this. The truth is whatever you want it to be. And they argued that you shouldn't try to take away other people's truths. And so just because they disagree with you doesn't mean that they're wrong, kind of a deal. And it's a weird way of kind of flipping it and kind of thinking about these kind of things. When we talk about the questioning the basis of knowledge, I think the idea is, how do we gain knowledge? Modernists thought it was discovered because they're very scientific. We're going to discover this stuff. Where postmodernism disagreed with that. They kind of thought that knowledge was more just kind of invented. It was more just kind of thought up, and so therefore it could be more subjective. It could be more personal to you. Your truth about something is going to be different than my truth about something, and that's okay. And they were okay with that. With the technology like the Holocaust and the atomic bomb, there are things going on till this day about all these things down here about the atomic bomb and the Vietnam Wars. Were they justified? Was it justified to do the atomic bomb? Was it justified to go into Vietnam? The Holocaust. We still have some arguments about the Holocaust, and did that happen? And the Cold War, which was in the 80s, and it lasted quite a while. I think it lasted about 30 years. The Cold War was more about intelligence and spying and those kind of things, and that was like the race to space, and that's kind of what started it between us and the Soviet Union. So, to kind of keep going with postmodernism, and basically, like I said before, postmodernism believes that there is no real truth. And since there is no real truth, you can't know something with certainty. I think a good question is always, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound? I think a modernist would say yes, it does. And I think postmodernists would say, well, that might not be the case, kind of a deal. And how do we know what we know? Again, how do we gain knowledge? Is it learned? Is it discovered? Is it invented? Do we create it ourselves? And language can change an object or a thing. So right now I'm on a computer. But if I start calling it something else, am I wrong? If I start calling it a made-up word, or if I start calling it a lamp, or if I start calling it a light bulb, am I wrong? And I think that's kind of where, you might say, well, of course you're wrong, but in my truth is that it's a light bulb. And so therefore I am right. And you shouldn't argue with me about it. Because no one knows anything. We just invented the word computer. We just invented the word, we just invent these words. And that's kind of what it is. It's kind of a trippy way to be thinking about stuff. And as we'll see in Slaughterhouse 5 is very postmodernist. It's very, how do we know what we know? Why do we do what we do kind of stuff. And so it'll get us talking about some of those things that Vonnegut writes about. So more from like a literary standpoint, it starts taking form in the 1960s. Groups of authors, including Vonnegut, were doing things differently than their predecessors. And so, again, modernism was more scientifically based. It was more real, quote unquote, real. It was more down the earth. Not a lot of science fiction. A lot of science fiction comes from this time period. It comes from the 1960s. Modernism was psychologically based, meaning that you could tie everything back to a character psychologically. And stuff that happened in their childhood and stuff like that, like Freud and some of those other psychologists. Postmodernism didn't really believe in that because you have your own truth. And so it doesn't matter what someone else says. And then the phrase down here, I am who I think you think I am. So if it's kind of a weird phrase there. And so basically, if I think that you think that I am a not a nice person, then I'm not a nice person. It's kind of the idea of like, well, if they don't think that I'm a nice teacher, then I'm just gonna not be a nice teacher then. And so I am who I think you think I am. And so it's just kind of a weird way to think about it in that sense of postmodernism. It also breaks genre conventions, meaning that it doesn't fit a normal literary kind of way of thinking sometimes. As you will see in Slaughterhouse 5, it's not going to do that. The texts are usually more open-ended, and it's more open for interpretation. It also doesn't give you all the information that you would need, and so it's going to make you fill in some gaps. And Slaughterhouse 5 is going to be one of those books that's going to make you fill in the gaps. And that's kind of what our focus is going to be on, is filling in the gaps. So a little bit about the actual story. The author is a character within the story, but he's not the main character. And I think that's really, really important. This book is 10 chapters. Chapter 1 and Chapter 10 are Kurt Vonnegut himself, like talking about writing the book and stuff like that. And then chapters 2 through 9 are about his main character, Billy Pilgrim. But even though the book's about Billy Pilgrim, Kurt Vonnegut is still in the book. There's a couple spots in there where he says, like, where Billy Pilgrim is talking to another soldier, and then Vonnegut pipes up and says, that was me. That was the author of this book. And it's like, oh, that's kind of a weird way of doing it, but I don't know. And so I think a question is always going to be, is Vonnegut actually Billy Pilgrim, the character of the story? Because it follows a guy who gets captured in war and goes to Dresden, and there's a firebombing and, all these kind of things. So it's very true to Vonnegut's own life, but he's writing it from a different perspective, and we'll talk about why that is. This book is also told in a non-linear order, meaning it doesn't go from A to B to C to D to E to F to G kind of a deal. It's going to go from it might start with A, then it goes to G, then it goes to C, then it goes to H, then it goes back to B, then it might go back to A, then it goes, and it kind of goes in a non-chronological order. And one of the things that we're going to do as a class is we're going to put it in chronological order. Because I think that's kind of where the meaning is at and like what's really going on here. And so this is from the book, where there is no beginning, no middle, no end, no suspense, no moral, no causes, no effects. And so even though Vonnegut says this, we're going to try to figure out some of those causes and effects and what's really going on here, because I think it's very similar to Twain, where he says there's no moral here, there's no plot, and yet there really is. I think that's another thing with Vonnegut. I think that there is a plot here, and I think that if you can look at it as a whole and put the pieces together, there is something there. And that's what I want you guys to talk about. So some questions to consider as you are reading, and I'm giving you these straight up because we're going to be doing a project with these when we're done reading the book, and so you might want to have your answers kind of ready to go. So the question is, does Billy Pilgrim travel through time in the book? If you think he does in the book, prove it. If you don't think he does, prove it and explain kind of what's really going on then, because there is time jumps. And so if he's not traveling through time, what is he doing? There is also Billy Pilgrim gets abducted by aliens. This is a war book, but it's also a science fiction book. And so the questions are, again, if you think he does get abducted by aliens, prove it. If you think it's someone else going on, then prove that as well, okay? And, like, I know that you're going to be, like, looking for an answer and, like, oh, this is a yes or no question. It's not that simple. I think it can lean one way or the other, but I wouldn't 100% say yes he did or no he didn't for any of these questions, okay? Some other questions to consider are, why is the book written the way that it is? Why is it jumping what's Vonnegut trying to do? And then also, is this an anti-war book? And if it is or if it isn't, does Vonnegut and Billy Pilgrim, do they differ on the idea of war? And they'll talk about that in the book, because there's a war going on. It takes place, most of it takes place during World War II, but some of it takes place during the Vietnam War as well. So it's kind of using World War II to kind of talk about the Vietnam War, which is kind of cool. All right, so that is it for the video. Your assignment is to fill out the Google form for this and then turn it in for Wednesday. I am looking forward to seeing Team White on Wednesday and then Team Red on Thursday. If you have any questions, shoot me an email, come to my office hours, all that good junk. All right, thank you for listening.